Good morning, everybody. Actually, it looks more like my Principles of Economics class to me. I mean, the students are always packed in the back. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Alan, for this introduction, and Derek. It's wonderful to be back in Canada. I've been in Canada from time to time, not enough, obviously. And I've worked with many people who are in the room here today, like Lars Brink and Richard Gray and Doug Headley, Bill Kerr, Jill Hobbs, Jill who will talk after me, and Alphonse Weersink. I'm going to stop because I'm going to forget people, and then people will come up to me, you didn't mention me, things. We'll be working more with the Canadian Agri-Economists in the next couple of years because our next International Agri-Econ conference will be in 2018 in Vancouver, and so we really look forward to that. Actually, when I look around the room, it looks more like St. Petersburg or Rome or Paris, and I had not associated this type of facilities with Canada, so it's a very nice location, I think. When I was preparing my slides, I was confronted with an interesting psychology, which I not yet identified as a psychology until this morning, which is that when I looked at the program and they said, you'll have 40 minutes to speak, I said, man, oh, this is so long, I can do plenty of time. And then I started loading up the issues in my PowerPoint, and then this morning I said, there's no way I'm going to be able to cover that in 40 minutes. So I guess for organizers, the best thing to do is give people half the time that you actually give them, or tell them you give them half the time. For the policy conference, I threw out all the mathematics in my slides except for one. But I will talk a bit about the structure of value chains. I'll talk about the impact on trade, and I will talk about the impact on development. So the development issues are possibly less important for Canadian agriculture and agri-food business, but I think they're really very important for what's going on in the world today. So I wanted to have some of that as well. Although I'm a Belgian, I'm not going to talk about CETA, but I'm happy to respond to questions about it afterwards if you want in the Q&A session. And I'm also not going to talk about beer, although I'm Belgian, but I'm also very happy to answer questions on that as well, or talk to you about it later today or tomorrow. Okay, so let me just get going. So I thought to kind of summarize what we're going to talk about value chain in one slide. So this is what the farmers get, this is what the processors get, this is what you get in a cafe, and this is what you get when you go to Starbucks, okay? So I really like this picture, and I think it needs to update because I guess maybe not the bottom part has increased in price, but probably the top part has increased in price since I first started using this slide. But I think in one picture it summarizes very well what's going on when you talk about value chains, and particularly about the value in the chain and how it relates to policy issues regarding farmers' revenues, etc. Let me just get you a bit of a feeling on some of the issues which are involved. I took some stories from the media. I don't always like the media, but on the one hand, what they do very well, much better than us academics, is summarize some key issues, right? This is a statement from the Polish government in a Polish newspaper 3 years ago. Food retailers in Europe failed to pass on price reductions to consumers, keeping their margins high and causing many farmers to abandon agriculture. I'm sure you could replace Europe or Poland there with many other countries in the world. This is a picture of protest in Belgium of the farmers' associations against low supermarket prices. However, not everybody is against concentrated retailing and the market power of them, okay? So here's a quote from Slovakia from 2007, and Nitra is the central city in Slovakia. Nitra, Slovakia, consumers demanded that the city government would give Lidl, which is a hard discounter. So there was a protest, actually a demonstration of these consumers, a license to open a supermarket in their part of town, which was disproportionately populated by pensioners and low-wage consumers which hope to benefit from increased competition and low prices. Okay? It's interesting, not all farmers in the world are against modern supermarkets. This is actually from India, and there the farmers actually are protesting because the government is regulating entrance of foreign retailers in the economy, in the country. And so they actually want investments by foreign retailers. And their argument is that Reliance, which is one of the modern supermarkets, buys up farm produce from local farmers. For many farmers, it saves them money because they no longer have to go through traditional middlemen to sell their goods. So this is an illustration where modern retailers, big ones, are actually creating competition rather than reducing competition. Then a couple of slides related to trade issues, TTIP in particular. This is from Euractiv website. TTIP talks are bogged down in food standards debate. Okay, food standards having a huge impact on the discussions there. Lots of demonstrations in Europe on that. This is another one, Greece to block TTIP unless the geographical indications are protected. I'm sure that this geographical indication was a big issue also with the Canadian trade agreement. And I could not resist to put this one in because the Germans have a concern that their protection of certain regional delicacies, I think it's a German interpretation of the word, could slacken under the planned EU-US free trade agreement. TTIP is sparkling, and it's a heated debate in Germany. Okay. A related issue, I thought this was interesting to put in, it's in Geneva, 17 June, this was last year, 2016, China, along with India, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Egypt, and Pakistan, called for drafting voluntary best practice guidelines regarding private standards at the WTO, because they see these private standards as basically non-tariff trade barriers, okay, and so they want to have something done about it. And so many of the other members, like the United States, the EU, they blocked the proposal on the ground that private standards do not fall under the WTO jurisdiction, and so we should not do anything about it there. Now, what does this mean about policy? Since this is a different world, can we analyze it? So this is, actually, I made a slide, I drew it on handwritten on a napkin actually, when Stefan Tangerman retired from OECD a couple of years ago, and many of you, I'm sure, know Stefan. And I was arguing that this is how we evaluated European Union agricultural policies in the good old days. So we had demand and supply functions, we had the support price of the EU, and the world market price, and we calculated all these effects, and of course then what the impact was on trade, okay? And so the issue I want to point out is that were the good old days, but they don't work anymore today if we want to do good policy analysis, because the world has become much more complex than that. And so, for example, in the EU now, a lot of the discussions today are no longer, of course, they're also about the prices, but the big issue right now is what they call unfair trading practices within the value chains, okay, where retailers and big food companies are basically not handling farmers or contracting the farmers in the right way. And for those of you who are interested in, there is a report which just came out from a task force which was set up by Commissioner Hogan, and they came out with essentially a report on basically on markets, and a lot of it is talk about unfair trading practice and how to deal with it. And very little is talked about price interventions, etc. So it's a totally new perspective on policy making. Okay, so related to this, can we actually deal with it as economists, okay, in terms of policy making? And so I already gave my handwritten picture of how we used to do it, and that this is no longer the way the world works. And this relates to a talk which Rich Sexton, who was then the president of the American Ag-Econ Association, gave a couple of years ago, and which is written up in the AJE. And I think it's a fantastic paper in terms of the ideas there. He essentially is arguing in the paper that microeconomic textbooks continue to point to agricultural markets as standard examples of competitive markets. And this is a quote from a very recent, very well-known microeconomic textbook. Okay, thousands of farmers produce wheat, thousands of buyers purchase the wheat, they produce flour, etc. And as a result, no single buyer can significantly affect the price of wheat. Or you could put another commodity than wheat there. So, what do we need for this to work? We need that the buyers and sellers must be many, they must be small relative to the size of the market, products must be homogeneous, information must be perfect on both sides of the market, and contracts are enforced. Actually, the fourth element is something I added to it, because I've been working more on developing and emerging economies. I think contract enforcement issue is a huge thing there, which it is here as well, but he didn't really. Anyhow, so Rich concludes, Rich Sexton, I don't know of any modern agricultural market that meets all of these conditions, and most don't mean any of them, okay? Which essentially we need a different way of analyzing these things. So in the reality of agri-food markets, and I put markets in quotes here because in some cases the governance systems are different than traditional markets, And actually, in a way, they are no longer spot markets, which is normally when we think about markets. There's a lot of concentration in market power. There's a lot of contracting and vertical relationships going on in the supply chains. Quality and safety requirements and the different diversity, heterogeneity of the commodities, actually, it's not an exception, it's the rule, okay? And all these things are to some extent interrelated. So how are we going to deal with this in our policy making? And so the story I'm essentially going to say is it's complex and there is no simple answers anymore. Okay, if there were already in the past, so I'm going to leave this. And so that makes it complex not only for analysts, for economists, in academia or in policy advice, but also, of course, for policymakers. Okay, what is the right answer? So the welfare effects are complex, the policy implications are not trivial. And I'm going to look at three different issues, as I said. One is on the concentration structure, the other one is on trade, and then on development. And I'm going to come to the same conclusion in each of these cases. So this is my only mathematics I have in here to illustrate. This is how it looks like now when you do some of these analysis. The summary is it's really messy. Okay, so the summary here also, and this is coming out of our book, is the cover of a recent book on this. So we find complex effects, theoretically, and typically mixed in the sense that it really differs sometimes from case to case, from the environmental conditions, from the institutional environments, from a number of factors, how farmers, consumers, trade, and development are affected. Okay? So let's talk first about concentration and market power. So the basic theory is very simple. Okay? It's like we have high concentration, it means you have market power, or the stronger the market power. This translates on both sides of the market. If you want, on the buyer side, this will push farm prices down. The farm prices are typically less concentrated, negotiating with stronger concentration downstream, sorry. And you have seller power, which essentially basically you lift up the prices to the consumer and you exploit monopoly or oligopoly power there. But the simple argument is simple, okay? So there's a number of complications there. The first ones are that there may be asymmetries in various ways. In the size of the companies, the cost or the strategy. So even if you have only a few companies, they may not collaborate or not collude, okay, because of these asymmetries. What you also have is vertical relationships often in the chains, and these vertical relationships, they may actually function best when there is just a couple of firms around, okay? If there is too much competition, basically these vertical relationships may break down. And this is something one needs to take into account. Actually, I just saw that Rich, together with a few students of him, I think, has a new paper where he actually tries to model what's the optimal level of competition there, okay? And he basically, when you integrate these types of things and search cost, etc., okay? And he says that you need some competition, you don't want to have pure monopolies, but if you have too much, okay, some of these vertical things, relationship may not function very well. There's more complications because you can have scale economies in some aspects. You can have reduction of transaction costs with larger companies, investments in R&D, you know, these are traditional arguments. And then an interesting point is the countervailing power. If you read literature on concentration in the food supply chains from 20, 30 years ago, okay, a lot of the discussions were about how small retailers can deal with big processing companies. Food company. Now today the story is very different, okay? Now the concentration is very much on the retailer side, and of course it may go both ways, but there is some issue of countervailing power vis-a-vis the larger processors. So this is all conceptual stuff, theory. What do empirical studies find? Essentially I find mixed effects. It depends on the case, it depends on the specific country, etc., where you analyze. So this is a list of various papers which have looked at the effect on consumer prices and the impact of concentration in retailing, and you see that both in rich countries and in poor countries there are mixed findings. So there's no simple general conclusion on that. If we look at the prices for the farmers or the impact on them, it's very similar. Okay? There's been Steve McCorriston from Exeter. He has just led a big European project consortium where we looked at different cases, etc. And essentially he said that his conclusion is that the results vary and depend on the variety of model assumptions and the case specifics. Okay, so again, we don't have any straightforward result there. All right, so if we want to do better, okay, a big issue is actually having information. So Sexton, again, and his colleagues, it's practically impossible to measure retailers' buying power as prices paid by retailers to their suppliers are typically not revealed. What's interesting, if you read the new task force report to the European Commissioner, which I just referred to, okay, so one of the recommendations is that there should be transparency in the pricing, so that we should actually collect these data and basically make them in some form accessible to, for researchers and for policy analysts, so that we can actually have a better perspective on that. Once you integrate contracts, the data problems get worse, because if there's some interlinking going on, that means that, for example, the suppliers get special access to inputs or whatever, then essentially the output price in itself is only an element of the contract, and so you would need to have the whole contract there in order to basically measure the welfare effects. And then the last point is what I call the endogeneity problems, and that is that the structure of the contract between different agents in the supply chain is most likely going to be endogenous, in the sense that it's going to depend on commodity characteristics, it's going to depend on institutional regulations, etc. And that makes it very hard to compare these things across value chains, commodity chains, and to draw general conclusions again. Okay? So all I'm saying is this is great news for lawyers, it's not so good news for policy advisors. Okay. Then, when I talk about standard, I'm going to look a bit more now about the role of standards in these value chains and trade. I have some historical stories there, so they're nothing new, okay? So this is probably the oldest written food law in the world. It was literally written in stone. This is from the kingdom of Babylon. And so the court of Hammurabi, which was the Babylonian king, and so that one, do I have a pointer here? I'll just use my own. So the bottom right picture is actually the stones where the codes are written in, here, all right? And so it says, if a wine seller makes the measure for drink smaller than the measure for corn, they shall drown her in the water. In terms of contract enforcement, this is very serious business over there. Something we know probably a bit better is from around the same period. The 10 Commandments: do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. And almost all these early discussions relate to food, of course, because that was the main commodity which was exchanged. This is from about 4,000 years later, or 3,000, this is from England, 800 years ago. The Magna Carta, which is the most important political document of that era. There shall be standard measures of wine, ale, and corn throughout the kingdom. And this is from around the same period. This is a private standard. In France, whoever puts into beer bay, pimento, or raisin is to be fined 20 francs. I like the next one. For such things are bad for the head and the body. Okay. So guys, this is one of the first food safety standards. Okay. So, when we think about standards in these value chains, okay, so the issue we have to think about when modeling these things, or modeling means just to think about these things, right, what the effects are, okay. What's very different when we think about trade, the role of standards is, so standards at the same time can create benefits for consumers or for producers as well, obviously, okay. So that's why we have a lot of regulations and standards in our society, right. And so they can, at the same time, they can create welfare, enhance welfare by reducing asymmetric information for consumers, reducing undesirable externalities of the production processes, but at the same time, then they can redistribute income, redistribute wealth by protecting certain groups, okay? And in a way, you could say that protectionism and increased total welfare can go hand in hand when you think about standards. And that's, of course, very different than when you think about tariffs or subsidies, where our traditional models are saying that basically they are reducing total welfare when they are basically redistributing income. So this has economic and political consequences. They have economic consequences in the sense that when you see a standard which has an impact on trade, this is not necessarily suboptimal. Okay, you can have optimal standards which do affect trade, and they probably do. At the same time, what you can also, on the political side, this means that either consumers or producers or both may lobby in favor of standards or against standards. Okay, also the political lobbying system is actually more complicated, because on tariffs it's simple. Okay, tariffs are hurting consumers and are benefiting producers, so you expect them to be on different sides of the lobby game, and that's not necessarily the case with standards. And so once we bring in some dynamic issues, the things get even more complicated. So I'll talk to them in a second. We've worked for years on basically modeling these things. And I've spent the last year actually writing up 2 papers where I've tried to make it as simple as possible to basically illustrate some of these things. And this is probably the simplest model I can come up with. This is my only area. So what we have is essentially, if we don't have a situation without a standard, this is the demand, zero, the zero demand line, the initial, and this is, or SO, this is supply side initial. So this is our initial equilibrium here. So this is the amount that is produced and consumed. This is a closed economy. And this is the equilibrium price, okay? So what happens when you introduce standards? And these standards are, for example, reducing asymmetric information. So what they do, they basically increase demand because they benefit consumers. So demand shifts from D0 line to the DS line, okay? And so that basically shifts the price from PO to P1. Okay, and this increase in price is driven by increased demand. So this is good for both producers and consumers. Of course, the introduction of the standard typically has implementation costs, and though these costs are captured by a shift from SO to SS. So you go this way. So this now increases the cost and the price, therefore, from here to there. So a cost increase from P1 to PS. So the new equilibrium, when you incorporate both effects, is here. So what's the effects? Well, prices go up significantly, but production and consumption go up also quite significantly, and the benefits for consumers are area A, and the benefits for producers are area B. It turns out in a closed economy, they always go together, okay? So if the implementation costs are lower than the benefits for the consumers in terms of reduced asymmetric information externalities, then both producers and consumers benefit, okay? And will lobby in favor. Once you bring in trade, this thing changes, because then you can have that producers benefit and consumers lose, or vice versa. So it gets more complicated. Now, what's the implications? Well, the implications is, and these are a couple of quotes I have here, or conclusions I have from a number of people who've done much more work on this than myself. John Beggin from Iowa State has done a lot of really good work on this, Stéphane Maret from Paris, and Frank van Tongeren from OECD. And so basically, the conclusion there is there's no blanket policy recommendation paralleling those on tariffs or quotas. So the optimal standard will depend on, for example, the relative ability of domestic and foreign industries to comply, nature of the implementation cost, etc. Now, if you have conceptually not a simple conclusion, that means your empirical analysis becomes much more important, right? And the issue there is also that the empirical measurement is complex. So you almost need like company-level data in terms of implementation cost to take into account the heterogeneity of the firms. How do you measure basically the impact on the consumers, this utility effect? So you have to evaluate somehow these external effects or the asymmetric costs as the reduction of the asymmetry of information. Okay, and if you look at the studies that are out there, they show different effects. Some studies show that these standards have constrained trade. Some show that they have enhanced trade by reducing transaction costs, and some conclude that there is no impact. Okay, so the conclusion there is from John Beggin, again a quote: "Standard like NTM, so non-tariff measures, are a challenge for us as agriculture economists." So, the next point I want to make, and so I'm moving to the dynamics, okay, is that what I've seen in a number of debates I've been involved in is that where standards have been said, well, these are inefficient, they are protectionist instruments, okay, and protectionist meaning to protect the producers of a country. And so when you go back through history and see how these standards have been introduced, it turns out they were not introduced under farmers or producers' pressure or lobbying, etc. Quite to the contrary, some of these standards have been introduced as the lobbying, under the pressure of lobbying from consumers, so from the other side, okay? And then, so how is this possible? Okay, and so my answer to that question has to do with the dynamics of standards and the political economy effects of the standards. And I'm going to give you some of the thinking of how I came to that, and then I'm going to give you the illustration on the chocolate regulations in a second to illustrate that. But you can also think about GMOs in the EU. I mean, the GMO regulations have been introduced under pressure, I think mostly from the consumption side and from the environmentalist side, not so much under pressure from the farmer side. Okay? So what you have, if you think about dynamics, then you basically have to think about the different periods, obviously, right? And so the argument is actually very simple. It turns out modeling it is very complicated, but the argument is actually quite simple. So initially, so basically if you have to introduce standards, yes or no, so you're going to look at what's the benefits for consumers or for the environment, and what are the costs of introducing the standards, right? And so you can have like a ratio, benefit-cost ratio, and depending on how this ratio are, you may introduce it or you may not introduce it. And of course, the lobbying of the different groups will influence the decision of the government. But you may come to a conclusion that even with relatively small differences between countries, okay, if this ratio varies, you can come to different types of standards which are being introduced. So that's the initial decision. Now let's assume that these countries are introducing different standards. Once you move on to the next period, what happens is that the standards will induce both on the consumption side and on the production side changes in behavior, in investments, etc. Okay? So you have companies adjusting their investments to, and this could be on the buying side or on the selling side, to basically take into account these regulations and these standards. This now is going to change their comparative advantage in the international world. And so this may change their lobbying. So maybe before they were against these regulations, but, okay, given the fact that they have invested in these standards, other companies in other countries not, this may affect their competitive advantage. And this may change their preferences and their lobbying activities, okay? And so in the paper I have on this, we're arguing essentially that this will typically lead to path dependency and hysteresis of these standards, okay? So that in the dynamics of, even if initially the differences were small, this difference will probably grow and make it more likely that these differences will continue in the long term. And this has implications when you have, for example, international trade agreements, because then you somehow want to basically come back to the same types of standards, okay? So if this is true, if you have this hysteresis type of argument, that means that you actually need big shocks to get out of it. And so not small changes in prices probably not going to get you out of this thing. And so you can have shocks from different origins if you want. You can have internal shocks. I'll give you an example in a second. Or you can have external shocks. And an external shock would be, for example, trade agreement, globalization through technology, better IT systems, etc. Okay? Now, and so this may lead to a change in standard. Is this good or bad? Well, that depends, right? Let's say that one country had a good standard and the other country had a bad standard, right? So what is the international integration going to lead you to? Is it going to lead to the fact that both countries are going to have the good standards? Or is it going to lead to the fact that both countries are going to have the bad standards? Again, there is no simple answer to this question. And I'll give you an example as well on both cases. So this is an example of shocks and standards from Europe, from very close to where I live. This is actually Dutch, okay? So my country, they speak French and another language which is Dutch, just like in, French and English here in Canada. So this is from the foot and mouth disease in the United Kingdom in 95-96, and so basically this thing, country life comes to a standstill. So there's a huge amount of slaughtering of cattle mostly and other animals in this period. And from a couple of years later in Belgium we had this huge crisis called the dioxin crisis, where toxic oils were actually entered into the vegetable oil system, if you wanted, the supply chain system, and this then basically got into the animal feed, and this led then into milk and other products where it showed up, and basically it killed off a whole bunch of chicken farms, etc., and also then in the milk and the baby food, etc. So there was a huge crisis. On the right-hand side of this front picture you see, so these are the shelves of the supermarkets, which were essentially empty for a lot of foods for almost a week before we got things under control. Okay, so these are just 2 pictures, but there's actually a couple more. And so this was all in the second half of the 1990s, in a couple of years. And this really transformed had a big impact on the European food safety regulations. So in 2002, we had the EU food law regulations, which introduced, which is a very extensive system of food regulations. So it's now a farm-to-fork approach. So again, the value chain, the supply chain, as used as a way of measuring these things, including a lot of traceability requirements. We have the European Food Safety Authority. Since that time, we didn't have any European regulations or systems or institutions until these things happened. So this is an example, and this had a lot of implications, I think, because if you see, so the left panel is a picture of total amount of SPS notifications to the WTO. So these are public regulations. And on the right panel, it's the global GAP producers, and GAPs are good agricultural practices. It's a very well-known standard, particularly in horticulture across the world. These are private standards. And you see that the big jump, okay, started around the early 2000s, okay? And I think what happened in Europe at that particular had a big impact initially on these things. And then, of course, these things have spread to other countries as well. I'll give you some two historical stories here. One is, I'm not going to talk about the beer story. I threw that one out, but as I said, I'll be happy to talk to you more about that later. I'll talk about chocolate and wine. So this story about chocolate is, actually we edited this book on the economics of chocolate, and I actually learned a lot about food standards in general and how our standards are really, a lot of them go back to the mid-19th century, about 1850. What happened in the mid-19th century is that there's 2 things that happened. One is that with the Industrial Revolution, you got big-scale economies in food production. So before, food production was often small-scale, artisanal, okay, and then with all kinds of industrial revolution outcomes, okay, in terms of refrigeration, in terms of railways, in terms of other things, transportation costs, etc. Scale economies become very important in food production, food processing, okay? At the same time, what happens is that it becomes easier now, technologically easier if you want, to test the quality and the ingredients of food commodities. Okay? At the one hand, big companies are now producing mass food products. At the same time, we're now better able to basically test the quality and the safety of these products. So what do these chemists, and a lot of them were pharmacists, find? They find that there's all kinds of stuff in the food which is not supposed to be in there. Okay? And so there's 2 types of ingredients. One is cheap, okay, but not unhealthy. You don't get sick from eating them. They're just not the quality is not there. I mean, it's cheaper ingredients. And the other one is that there are actually poisonous things in the food, and often these poisonous things are used to cover the bad taste of the cheap food. So they often the cheap ingredients, they often go together. Actually, if you remember, there was this big milk scandal in China about a couple of years ago. I think it was 2008. I mean, the story is very similar, you see. So they put water in the milk to expand, so they have a cheap ingredient, water in the milk, and essentially to cover up for it, that's why they added the poisonous stuff. So it's very similar to what's happening right there. So you have public outrages when people publish these findings, and so this triggered a whole bunch of food standards throughout the world. So they initially are introduced in Western Europe. I mean, that's where a lot of the initial action, if you want, happens, but they spread to many other countries as well. So what's interesting is that in all the countries, these standards are introduced, but they take very different forms, okay? And I'm going to talk about the case France versus the UK, and Germany had kind of a mixed form. So the British approach was essentially, you prohibit bad stuff. So you say anything which is bad for people, injurious to health, is not allowed to be included an ingredient in food. It's a very simple rule, okay? You can put cheaper stuff in there, okay? But you have to put it on the label then. You're allowed to do it, but you got to label it. So that was the basic rules of the British approach. And for example, Canada in 1875, I checked it out, and the United States in 1906 followed this British model initially. The French approach was very different. The French initially, it took them a while, you see, because the British model was already introduced in 1860, 1875. So the French needed another crisis to get their act together. But once they got their act together, the French said, okay, we're going to fix this thing for once and for all. They said chocolate is this. So they defined it by law. So they didn't say what you could not put in it. They said this is what you should be putting into it. All right? And so chocolate has to be made from a blend of sugar and cacao mass, at least so much of the product, etc. Several other countries, particularly on continental Europe, like Belgium, Spain, followed this approach. What happened? So these are different standards, both to protect consumers. So they came under pressure from the consumption side, right? So what happens is that the British companies follow the British rules, the French companies follow the French rules, okay? And one of the issues which later played a big role in international discussions was the role of cacao butter equivalents, CBEs. This, for example, palm oil and things like that. So they're cheaper than cacao, but they basically they don't taste as good and things like that, right? But they were allowed in the British model as long as you put it on the label. What happened when European Union started? So we go back to 1957, we have the 6 additional members, and so all of them, just kind of coincidence, had a model which is very close to the French model. So the French model becomes the European model. This will come back in my next story as well. Okay? And so the chocolate standards we had until very recently were almost identical to the ones that France had introduced in 1910. Then in 1973, quite some time later, the United Kingdom, Ireland and Denmark joined the EU. It turned out that they had mostly followed the British model, and so they were allowing these CBEs. And the result was a chocolate war, as they call it, right? And so for years, okay, so the British companies like Cadbury were really excited about European accession because they saw this big European continent as potential consumers of their cheaper chocolate, okay? And then the French companies and the Belgian companies said, well, that's not chocolate, okay? I don't know what it is, but it's certainly not chocolate because chocolate is produced according to these regulations. So basically for 30 years, British chocolate was banned from the continent, if you want. So it took 30 years to come to a compromise, and so CBEs in this compromise were allowed up to a certain percentage in all of the EU. And so what you see is that the private companies, okay, they fall back on their original standards and they use what used to be a public standard now as some kind of a quality kind of tradition or basically a quality signals vis-a-vis their consumers. So none of the French or Belgian or other companies have actually switched their composition to this thing. So the last line is kind of a good, I put 2 questions marks. What will happen to the chocolate regulations when Britain leaves the EU again? Will we move back to ours or will they move back to theirs? I don't know. So the second story is about wine standards. How am I doing in terms of time? Sorry? Okay, good. But you don't know how much I still have coming. All right, so this is a quote from the New York Times in 2012. Poured from the bottle, it looks like wine. Swirled around the glass, it smells like wine. Sure enough, it tastes like wine too. But in the EU, the closest it may come to being called wine is a fruit-based alcoholic beverage. Okay? And so the thing is, and it's basically, it is a wine which had been produced from grapes which were imported into the EU. Okay? And this is not wine, according to the EU. Now, where does this come from? Okay? So this is the question. Which country was the world's largest wine exporter in 1960? I'm sure some of you know the answer already, and I'll answer this at the end of my presentation, but it has to do with it. So in 1860, 100 years earlier than that even, so this is like a century and a half ago, what happens is that France, the French wine production, is basically devastated by Phylloxera vastatrix. So Phylloxera was known in this part of the world, and basically the grape, so the vines here, were resistant to it, but not the European vines. So when basically it's a little bug, okay, when it basically makes its way into Europe, it just destroys the French vineyards. And the impact is huge, okay? And so wine production declined by 70% in like a decade. And as a result, France suddenly has to start importing wine. And that's where you see the line, so the blue line going up. So this is imports of wine into France. At the same time, France has several northern African colonies, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and they start producing wine there to some extent. I mean, it's 2 factors. One is that a lot of these people who got bankrupt because of the disease move to North Africa and start producing wine there. And the other reason is because France needs to import wine, and so there's a demand. So it's both a supply and a demand effect. All right. Now, of course, no. It takes them actually quite a while. It takes until the end of the 1880s, 1890s, to find a cure against it. And they do it essentially by mixing, either through grafting or through hybridization, with American vines. Okay, so that's how they recover. So production recover, and then there's a huge impact on the wine market, on the wine prices, of course, because you have all these imports coming in, and at the same time, wine production in France goes up again, and so prices just go through the floor. This leads to a huge demonstration from French wine growers for the government to intervene. So there's a lot of policy makers or policy advisors in this room. So what do you do if the pressure's higher? First thing you do is you raise the import tariffs. Okay, so France just basically blocks the import tariffs, and the first effect is that it totally halts the imports from Spain and Italy, which have grown to become big exporters to France, you see. And so the line clearly, you see the fall in imports into France very clearly there. Eh? But this one here, that's because of the import tariffs. But the problem is that some of the imports are now coming from the North African colonies, and basically because they're colonies, they're part of the customs area, and so they're not hurt by import tariffs, because you can't import tariffs on your own colony, according to the regulations then. So they keep coming in, and so the pressure stays. So to some extent, the pressure is stopped. So what's the next thing? And so there was another conflict, which is you had the traditional wine regions like Bordeaux, Champagne, etc. But with these new vines which had been created, particularly the hybrids, okay, they were much more productive. They could be grown in different climates, etc. So you had all kinds of regions in France which now started producing wine, and very effectively so. And so you had also within France a conflict. So in a way, there's three conflicts. One is the ones with Spain, Italy, and Greece. One is the one with the French producers versus the Algerian and North African producers. And the other one is within France, between the traditional ones and the new regions. Okay? And so, of course, imports are going to help against the first one, but not against the second and the third group. And so there you need quality standards for, right? So this is where the appellations come from. So there, for the first time, officially, according to the rules, quality, okay, whether something is wine or not wine or something else they may want to call wine, is linked to where it is produced. And so the regions of Bordeaux, Cognac, Champagne, and so are really, that's the big pressure for doing that. But because this Algerian and Tunisian import just keep coming in, basically it really doesn't completely solve the problem. And then one of the worst things is that this is an advertising campaign where the Algerians, okay, are now claiming consommateurs français boivent ce vin français, that they are French wine, okay? And basically that totally triggers an uproar. And so then when the statut viticole is introduced, where the restrictions and the quality standards and the regulation are made much, much more tighter than they used to be done. And so the point I'm making now is that our current regulations, which are now expanded over the entire European Union of 28 member states, are essentially those which were introduced in 1908 and 1935. Okay? Just a small point, so the Greek raisins, so there was no exports of Greek raisins to France until the crisis struck in France. So it was a huge increase in a couple of years. And this is the time that basically import tariffs are being imposed, not just on wine, but also on the imported raisins, which were used to produce wine in France. And so that helps to some extent. And then the second thing is a new standard which defines wine in Europe, in France at that point, but still today, as the beverage made of the fermented juice of grapes. So it excludes wine, and then later on the grapes have to come from inside the country or the region. So, and then what happens to the French regulations? Essentially, initially, there's only two countries with the initial 6 members which had a lot of wine, which is Italy and France. And essentially, Italy had a much more liberal regime, both in terms of price regulation, in terms of standards. And the initial compromise in 1970, the common wine policy, is a compromise between this very rigid, very regulated system on the one hand of France and a much more liberal system of Italy. And so so that's the compromise. The result is that the Italians suddenly say like, whoa, we get higher prices now. So they massively start to produce more wine, export it to France, and then the French again they didn't like that. So they start blocking the ports, destroying the Italian wine coming in, and so this leads to, we didn't only have a chocolate war, we had a wine war as well inside Europe. And so this leads to a change of the regulations, and essentially the French regulations of pre-EU effectively become EU regulations. So we get more and more regulations. And so essentially 60% of the world's wine is inside the EU now and is covered by these old regulations. Okay, and so this is where this comes from. So the lessons is that shocks and politics play an important part in standard setting. It's not obvious to separate welfare-enhancing standards from the welfare-reducing effects, and that international integration can lead both to the removal of these suboptimal standards, but they also can lead to the expansion of these suboptimal standards. So this is the political story there. How much more time do I have, Alan, or am I used to that? 10 minutes? Perfect. So I'm just going to have a couple of words on these development issues of these value chains and standards. The story here is more to do with, it's kind of how the institutional organization of these supply chains, where we talked about initially, and basically where these standards come together. Because what you really do with these global value chains is you basically export your standards to other countries, okay? And so this is, to some extent, public standards, which are there on the ports if you want to trade, but they're also, to some extent, private standards, which private companies in this supply chain, the big private companies, can impose, okay? And so it's linking, if you want, rich consumers to poor producers. So most of the stuff here we've done is on the welfare effects. And so the big critique on these standards is that standards and value chains are increasing poverty by marginalizing poor producers, typically smallholder farmers, who cannot satisfy these requirements, okay? So we've done a lot of work about this, a lot of empirical work as well, and I think this critique is largely wrong, okay? It's easy to understand, and you hear it all the time, and it's intuitively, you find it, and I think it's wrong mostly because of a misunderstanding of how these value chains actually work. So what happens is that the organization of the value chains is endogenous in these things. So what happens if you have high standards on the consumer side, if you want, and you need to have these poor farmers doing all kinds of things to satisfy these standards, right? So they can't do it because they don't have the inputs, they don't have the know-how, they don't have the management, they don't have the capital, etc. What happens in a lot of these cases is that actually other agents in the middle of the chains who do have the know-how, who do have the capital, who somehow can get access to the inputs, actually reorganize how these chains work in order to make this possible, okay? And so we see a lot of vertical coordination. So this could be all kinds of various forms of contracting. And to give you a very simple way of thinking about it, okay, illustrating. So this is a simple value chain. And so you have inputs, the farmer, the processor, and the consumer, right? So the product is the red line, the red arrow. They go from top to bottom here, right? But there is another stream which goes from bottom to top, which is the financial stream, okay? Because if you want to buy products, you got to pay for it. Now, what we know, okay, is that in a lot of, even in rich countries, but certainly in poor countries, this thing doesn't work very well, okay? Rural finance, access to finance capital for farmers is really problematic over almost everywhere. So therefore, these things cannot work. So what can you do to handle this? Well, you can reorganize your value chain. And this is one way of doing it. There's all kinds of different ways how you can do it. And so one way of doing it is you set up a contracting system where essentially this contracting system provides inputs and technology through here to the farmers. Okay, the farmer gets the raw material through here to the processor, and the finance goes in this way. So it goes both ways here. Essentially the process provides finance, and this goes to technology. Okay, and this is I only want to put in one slide. I can have a whole bunch where you see the different mechanisms, but that's the idea, okay? This is a way to get finance and inputs and there. So we've done a lot of studies over the whole world over the years, and so this is one picture from our work. What's interesting, okay, is that what we saw in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, which is when we had the whole transition from this communist system to a capitalist system, that a lot of the supply chain restructuring which took place, these models we now see play in Africa and Asia today with, like, say, a 20-year delay. And that's, of course, because the incomes are much higher in Eastern Europe in those days than they were. And so this is, for example, in the sugar sector in Slovakia, one of these countries, where we we had very good company-level data there, which you almost never get. That's why we were able to put this picture together. So this is the output in the sugar sector. This is 1990 when the changes start. So in 3 years' time, output collapses by roughly 25%, okay? Big decline, all right? This is when these vertical coordinations, these contracting systems are put in. By that time, the sugar companies, the processing companies have been privatized. A lot of Western companies have bought them, and they are setting up these contracting systems. And so what you see here is that this is how production goes from there. So it's a huge increase as a consequence, okay? And so initially it's working with the farmers, getting them inputs, learning them how to satisfy certain requirements, etc. You see yields go up and sugar content go up, but the big increase comes when they set up finance systems, because the farms essentially didn't have any access to finance. The banks wouldn't lend to them, etc. So when they set these contracting systems up with interlinked finance arrangements, often with the local banks, that's when you see the contract area goes up and the production goes through the roof. And so this type of effects, and this is strong, this is a 7-year period, so it's short. So these are similar data from the Polish dairy sector, again in a 7-year period, and you see huge investments in cooling equipment, which is which is technology which is crucial for farming, for the quality of the milk, obviously. These are all very small farms, what you see, okay? This is from Bulgaria, same time, 7-year period, 2003-2009, Bulgaria was lagging behind a bit, and there you see that the quality of the milk increased dramatically over this period, and a lot of it again had to do with these contracting systems. Okay. So my last couple of slides are on what's happening in Africa. And so we see there's a lot of horticultural exports growth from developing countries into both North America and to the European Union. And so in all these things, these are the standards which are basically imposed on these producers. So despite the fact that the standards have grown a lot, exports have still grown almost exponentially since then. And the way these things are organized are all through these contracting systems. So these are pictures from, this is an area in Senegal, which is in West Africa, where we have been working for almost 15 years now. We have been going back regularly, seeing how these supply chain systems develop. And there you see that the people in the households in this region, this is a vegetable producing region, who are involved in these export value chains have gone from 8% to half of all the households in the region. Okay? And so this line shows big structural change. This is when the food crisis happens in Europe, which I just explained. You see, initially they were mostly involved as contract farmers, okay? And at that particular time, the larger exporters said, listen, we can't satisfy these European tighter standards anymore with our contracting system, so we have to start producing ourselves. And so this is when there's a big structural shift from small-scale contracting to large-scale production systems, and these people are involved as workers on these farms, okay? So you see pictures here from the processing side. What's the impact? So the employment characteristics are typical. It's very labor-intensive, low-skilled jobs, temporary contract, and often female work, so there's a big gender component. The effects we found now, okay, from working 10, 15 years, is that the impacts are incredible. So these are the income effects when we measured them initially. So these are the average incomes in the region. This is roughly the poverty line. These are from households which are not involved in these supply chains. These are from households which are involved, on the right-hand side, as contract farmers. So their incomes are 3 times as high as the ones which are not involved. And these are the ones from the households where people work in these larger companies, either in the processing or on the farms itself. Okay, and they're double the size. Okay, and so our most recent data are from the poverty effects in this region. Okay, and so there you see that in 2006 and 2013, there's been some decline in poverty in rural Senegal, and in 2006 here, basically the poverty in the region where these companies started was roughly the same. And so by now, 2013, 7 years later again, poverty has halved there. So the poverty effects are huge in terms of these things. Okay, so we find that there's mixed evidence in terms of whether smallholders are involved in these value chains, or it's mostly through the larger farms. If they're involved, the income effects are strong. and that the benefits from the labor market, from employment on the largest farms, are often ignored in a lot of the discussions there. This is my concluding slide. So the world of value chains is complex. So concentration may or may not imply market power. Standards can be barriers to trade and to development, and standards can be catalysts as well to trade and to development. Okay? And so I think it's our work to get a better understanding of these complexities and to use them to provide the right policy advice. And I think there's a lot of work to be done, which in a way is good news for us as well. So that's it.
Okay. Thank you.